Hi, chess fans. We are looking at the first round in the final of this year's World Cup between Levon Aronian with white and Liren with black. And Levon played the English opening c4, and Liren responded with a setup with e6 and d5. After c takes, e takes, e5, white has this pawn push here, knight e4, knight f3, bishop f5, bishop e2. Let's have a look at this position. Why is white holding off of playing d4? And actually already in this move, d4 looks like a natural move. So why is white not playing this? Why is white playing bishop e2 here? So even though d4 might look like a more natural move at first glance, it actually leaves white's structure pretty vulnerable. And black can immediately try to exploit this with bishop b4 pinning the knight against the king. And for example, if white played bishop to d2, maybe it would be better to play queen a4 here to get some counterplay. But if white played bishop d2, takes, castle, bishop e2, c5, black gets a lot of pressure against the structure. And if white tries to release that pressure with d takes c, black can exchange here and reach a structure where white's pawns are very weak. Okay, so that's why Levon played bishop e2, very interesting looking move. And now black in turn played d4. So white, by not playing d4 himself, allowed black to push his pawn as well. But it turns out that after knight takes, bishop takes, white has this very strong bishop and the plan to push the e6 pawn after castling and playing rook e1. So for example, if black pushed his pawn, let's just say, white can castle, and after knight c6, rook e1 attacks the bishop. If the bishop moves away, white has this really strong pawn push. So just to illustrate this plan, let's have a look at a better move. For example, knight c6, attacking the pawn. Similarly, white has castle and now bishop e7, blocking the the file on the king. But still, rook e1 hits the bishop. Let's say the bishop moves to f5, protecting the e6 square a little bit. Still, white can improve pressure, queen b3, and after castle, still e6 is very strong. So because of this plan, Liren played bishop to d5, exchanging this bishop immediately. White increases pressure, but black is simply happy to exchange. Okay, the game continued knight c6, a developing move, castle, developing move, queen d7. Okay, so black is hinting at castling longside. d3, a consolidating move and opening this diagonal for the bishop. And now Liren played queen e6, and this is, in my opinion, a very strong move. But, you know, there might be maybe more natural looking moves. Develop this bishop, castling, developing this bishop and then castling. You know, what's the purpose of this move? Queen to e6. Okay. For me, this is one of the key moves in the game because it's a little bit of a tactical move. It's a tactical move because white now has to make a decision, and many of the choices that white could make give black a little advantage. So for example, if white doesn't do anything, for example, white plays h3, what is black threatening even? Well, black is now threatening to take these queens, and then suddenly black has created this positional resource of the d4 passed pawn. So at the moment the pawn is protected by the knight and the rook, but white does not have a passed pawn. So if anything, black is better in this position. Okay, so let's say white does not want this to happen and protects the queen with b3, so that if black takes with the queen, white can retake with the pawn, and this guy here doesn't become a passed pawn. In this position, black can very naturally develop his bishop, and he gets all these dark squares. And if black plays bishop b2, developing as well, putting pressure on the pawn, and maybe controlling this square here as well, black has very natural moves, long castle, and let's say white wants to push this bishop away, a3, then black can exchange queens, and actually play the bishop to c3. And if the bishop gets exchanged here, white has created a pass pawn here that is actually quite annoying to get. These pawns here are weak on d3 and e5, so immediately black is threatening to take this pawn. And let's say white wants to defend this pawn, then black has c2, and let's say rook d2, attacking the other pawn. And here white has to make a choice, and in the end, white will lose a pawn, or at least get much better play, because he has to defend this pawn on e5, which is very weak. Okay, so this plan with protecting the queen also doesn't work. And of course, if the knight takes this pawn, then white simply blunders a piece, because queen takes and then this knight is hanging. Okay, so white has to move the queen away. And let's say probably the best square to move the queen away is queen a4, because it pins this knight against the king. But then black can simply continue developing castle. And then there's pressure on the e5 pawn, and this pawn is well protected. But white has some active resources here, attacking the queen. If the queen drops back, f4. But black has at least equality in this position, because f4 is protecting the e5 pawn. But black's bishop on f8 is a little bit better than the bishop on c1, because this pawn is caging this bishop in. And also the king is a little bit safer here on c8 than white's king on g1. For example, to look at the forcing line, black can immediately play f6 and take advantage of the fact that this knight can be pushed around a little bit. So if this knight moves to e4, can play f5, if it moves back to g5, we can play h6, knight f3, and immediately the queen can infiltrate white's position, and this forced line kind of highlights the weakness of this bishop relative to this bishop here. So it's already a position that's a little bit easier to play for black. But okay, I don't know, the engine gives equality or a better position for white, but then on the other hand, what the engine should suggest is already forcing moves like queen b5, and then a sequence of pretty exact moves, or exchanging the queens. And the equality, black has reached at least equality, and in my opinion, black has a much clearer plan. Okay, so queen a4, moving the queen away, is certainly playable. Aronian made the decision after queen e6 to exchange these queens and go into a position where f takes e. And let's have a look at this position. So why is this better for black? So the game continued knight g5, attacking the pawn, and the king can move to d7. Okay, so this position is very symmetrical. The advanced pawns are on dark squares, and both sides have dark squared bishops. The backward pawns are light squares, so they cannot be attacked by the bishops. In this position, the knights attack and defend their counterparts here in the center, so it's a very symmetrical position. The only difference really is that this king is still in the center and hasn't castled, and this king has castled already. And actually in this position, this is a slight advantage for black, because the king actually is better in the center, doing a job, protecting the e6 pawn, and white would love to maybe have his king also here on e2, performing the same job. But it's a very, very slight advantage. Let's have a look how the game continued. So knight g5, king d7, f4. So white is protecting this pawn and trying to get some play here on the king side. Game continued, bishop to e7, but white doesn't want to exchange this knight, moves it to e4, central square, but on the other hand, it's kind of dominated by this bishop. Rook a f8. Black is trying to get some play on the f4 pawn. After bishop d2, again, this bishop looks a little bit weak in my opinion. It's blocked by these two pawns, so white has to spend a tempo to develop it. Black plays g5. And can white take this pawn? No, quick tactical question. White cannot take this pawn because black simply takes a pawn as well, but black takes a much stronger pawn. The knight is very central here, other than this knight, which is dominated by the bishop on e7. This knight is much more useful. It's attacking a pawn, and also taking away this pawn gives black control of the d6 square and the f6 square, which are otherwise squares that white would love to put his knight on. So white cannot take this pawn, and as a consequence, black gets some serious pressure on the f4 pawn. Game continued g3, and now the rook goes on the open file against the king. Levon moved his king away, and now black has a clear plan. Black is putting serious pressure on the f4 pawn, and all the pieces are coordinating well. This bishop is supporting this pawn. These rooks are perfectly placed against the king once the position opens and to attack the f4 pawn. And if this pawn ever moves, the knight is ready to jump in here. And you know, if we go in some sort of endgame, this king is also ready to be activated in the endgame. So black's pieces coordinate very harmoniously against this f4 pawn. But now after king to h1, it's black to move. And even though black has a clear plan how to continue. Imagine you're black, how would you continue here? Okay, if you got some pressure, the idea is to create some additional resources. So for example, all of these pieces are kind of tied down in this defense. So black could play a6 with the idea of generating some space advantage on the queen side. Okay, that's one plan. Black could also play rook f5 with the idea of rook g to f8, increasing pressure on the f4 pawn. All of these are good plans. Liren decides to release the pressure, g takes f, and then grab the open g file. So basically black is releasing the pressure to get in return the resource of the doubled rooks on the open file, which is a very good resource, especially because the king is open here. Good, so black has grabbed this position advantage. Now, how to best play with white? Now, this is really something where a super grandmaster like Levon Aronian can teach us a lot. You know, in this position where you got this pressure going on, how to best continue. Okay, so in theory, we all know what to do. We should look for counterplay. So where is some counterplay in this position? Okay, it's maybe a bit hard to see, but maybe it would be helpful to see, okay, all black's pieces are here on the king side. So it might be worth looking for some counterplay on the queen side. And what could that counterplay be? Does black have any weaknesses? Well, this pawn could potentially be weak, and this knight is defending it. So one plan, and it's the plan that Levon played in the game, is rook ac1 with the idea of pushing the b pawn to attack the knight, so that the defender of this pawn has to move away, and the rook can jump into c4 and take this pawn with check. So black continued doubling the rooks, and in this position Levon could have played b4, and if, for example, the rook would have moved into the position, just to illustrate the plan, white has b5, knight moves back, and then the rook jumps into c4, ready to take the pawn. So this would have been a very active plan. And if instead knight takes, white has bishop takes, and Okay, now this gets very tactical. We have to look at the variations very closely. Here actually the winning move is this knight fork, because this bishop is controlling the f6 square, and so that's why black cannot take here, because we simply exchange and then win the exchange, win a rook against a knight. Okay, so that's why black cannot take here. So it would have been a good plan, but Levon played a3, going slower, preparing to play b4. Maybe he didn't want to commit so much and also give his opponent to make some room to make some mistakes. Maybe he was also afraid that after b4, black can simply avoid his plan, and then the rook is kind of stuck here, away from the action happening on the king side, and this plan is actually quite slow, because pushing the knight away might turn out more difficult than planned. Okay, so in any way, Levon continued with a3, but I think the point is great to play rook ac1 with an active plan. Rook fg8, a3, a5, so Liren is also a very strong grandmaster playing against this plan, preventing counterplay from white. And now, how to create more counterplay? Imagine you're white. How to get more counterplay? Okay, these super strong grandmasters are seeing counterplay everywhere. Levon played rook f3 with the idea of playing rook to h3, attacking this pawn, and moving this knight over to g3, blocking off the doubled rooks. Game continued b6, rook h3, rook moves up because this pawn was attacked, and knight g3. So in this position, this knight has kind of neutralized black's resource of the doubled rooks, and this pawn cannot move forward because the rook would take it. So the rook, is maybe now very bound to this task, but on the other hand, these two rooks are also very committed to this file. So if black tries to regroup his rooks, white also has time to regroup his rook. Okay, and this, like the move rook a1 with the plan of b4, and then the rook to h3 with the plan of sealing off this file and getting some play against the pawn, was enough counterplay to draw the game. So the game continued knight d8, b4. So basically, white is closing the position here on the queen side. b5, king g2. Now the king improves his position. It's ready to move all the way to the center of the board. Knight c6, putting some pressure on the b4 pawn. White protects that pawn. Rook f7. And now, interestingly, so after king f6, black has the resource knight takes e5, and this pawn is blocked. So that was the idea behind knight c6, and in combination with rook to f7, blocking the king's march to the center. And so Levon does not continue with his king, so if the king ever moves on any of these squares here, the knight takes this pawn, so the king is kept here on this side of the board. And so Levon played rook h5, maybe getting some active planes later with f5, just moving the rook to a more active square and also preventing any h5 plans with the pawn. Then continued rook g8, hinting at maybe bringing the rook to some active play on the other side of the board. But rook h6 is basically inviting black to do this, taking the g6 square away from the rook, because if rook moves up, white could exchange here. So for example, this would favor white's drawing chances because some rooks are exchanged. But basically in this position also, any black's plans to infiltrate the position here would be met with active plans by white. For example, after rook h8, f5, and for example, if takes, rook h5 is allowing e6. So by playing rook to h6, white is tactically preventing black from swinging his rook over because of this threat. And so the rook, so the bishop pushes the rook away, rook h3, bishop e7, and basically here both players repeated moves, because both players have resources available to counter each other's active plans, and the game was drawn. But again, very, very interesting move, queen e6, bringing black into the position where he gets some serious pressure on the f4 pawn, and then grabbing the open file with both rooks, and then Levon creating counterplay with active rook moves, and in the end creating a position where the counterplay is enough to draw the game. Very instructive game. I hope you liked watching this video and learned a little bit for your practical game. And stay tuned and see you next time. Bye bye.